All right, tearing into the top end on this Arctic Cat 500. We're gonna get into the top end here, the valve cover, the cylinder head. We've got the cylinder, the cam chain parts here, the tensioner. We've already removed the clutches. You should have seen the video on that. We've got the charging system over here, the flywheel and the stator. Recoil pull star is already off. I pulled that off when I showed you how to adjust the valves on this. It's a Suzuki motor, but it came out of an Arctic Cat. So you can use it for any of those machines, the Vinson 500, the Arctic Cat 500. It's gonna be the exact same motor. We've got the rear output shaft coming off here. I'm gonna show you how to remove that, as well as the front joint here. I'm gonna show you how to pull that as well. So gonna start off with the top end here. We've got 10mm bolts all the way around this cylinder head cover. That's gonna allow us to pull this off. Before we do that, I'm actually gonna remove our cam chain tensioner. We've got our cam in here, inside of our cover here, and if we pull this cylinder head cover off without removing this tensioner here, we've got potential to bind that cam and potentially break some parts, or at least tweak some of these aluminum parts in here. So, all right, we've got a 5mm Allen that we're gonna remove here, and instead of using an impact on here, I like to use these smaller wrenches to start, and then once we get them loosened up, then we can grab our DeWalt impact driver here with a socket and remove these. I like using the impacts. I particularly like the DeWalt brand. There's several other makes and models that are great, but we can either use a socket at this point or just finish pulling them out with this little L wrench here. So get that removed. I'll show you what this cam chain tensioner looks like here. You can see it kind of pushed it out of there because we've got some tension on this. So if we were to remove this 10mm bolt here, inside of here, you could take a flat screwdriver. You could actually turn this tensioner manually like this, and it's gonna be spring loaded in. So when you're going back together, what I like to do is actually take this tensioner, turn it all the way in, and then you can kind of hold it in place there. Now, you wanna make sure you don't leave it there, okay? Now we can just set it down there. Okay, if you were to tap on it like that, it would shoot that back out, or you just take that screwdriver there, turn it out like 1/8 of a turn, it would snap into place there. This is an automatic cam chain tensioner, so it goes out, it doesn't come back in without you physically doing it. So once you get everything in position on your top end, then you can release that, spring loads out, and you shouldn't need to make any more adjustments. These do wear out. Same way with your cam chain. I'll get to that here in a little bit, but you do want to change these periodically. If you're going through the top end, I like to just replace those at that time. If you're rebuilding your motor, also replace your cam chain tensioner. They are fairly inexpensive and very, very important. Again, I'll get into that here in a little bit. Now we're going to go around and remove all these 10mm bolts on our cylinder head cover. Remove our cam adjust covers here. And then there's bolts underneath of here that you won't be able to get to these really with a socket anyways without pulling that cover, but you also have a bolt down in here. Okay, and you could maybe see there when I was pulling that up, it kind of snapped it and pulled this up. Now that's what I'm talking about. The amount of pressure on this cam chain and this cam will actually cause this to lift off of there, kind of binding this cover. So you want to be really careful. Pulling this cam chain tensioner out isn't going to completely eliminate the pressure that you're going to feel there, but it will help. And I like to remove these, otherwise you're searching for these all over the place. I'll keep these with the cam adjuster covers here, so I'll keep it with these. Now what I'll do, because it's kind of bound in there, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but you can stick anything in there, a screwdriver, a punch, anything to try to pick this up. What you don't want to do is if it's taking a lot of work, you don't want to just start cranking on this. You're going to damage your top mount here. You could potentially damage your surface here. So like that, you could also take a rubber mallet, just kind of tap either direction there to loosen that up. This is most of the time covered with not a paper gasket, but a liquid gasket. So I like to use a 1211 gasket maker to put around here, seal that up. But a lot of times that's pretty sticky when you're pulling that apart. So that's why you kind of got to use a little bit of force there. Here's your rockers here. So when you're adjusting valves, you're turning these little screws up top here. That is determining the gap between these posts here and the top of your valve here. So when you're measuring between there and there. So we'll set that aside for now, and we've got our cam ready to come out there. So we've got it loosened up. Now, more than likely, you're not gonna be able to take and just pull this off, like would be really sweet. So I'm gonna flip this around. Because there's too much pressure still on at this time. So you got quite a bit of gap in there now with your cam chain, but I don't think enough to be able to pull that cam chain off of there if your cam chain is in decent condition at all. So what I do at this point, I'll grab a flat screwdriver, and there's a little plate here that you gotta take and smash. It's a little keeper, and you gotta flatten this. Once you get it flattened, you can take, and probably gonna just be able to see one side of this cam chain sprocket. This bolt here that we removed, it's a 10 millimeter. We'll set that aside. Now what we're gonna do is turn this motor over. You wanna make sure if you're turning over up here like I'm doing, which isn't very smart, you can get your finger stuck in there. So we'll turn that over. And if you've got good compression, this is gonna be a little bit of work to do. But you turn it over far enough to get to that other bolt there. Right there. Same thing, flatten this keeper. We'll grab our socket again and our impact. Zip that off of there. And we've got our bolt that we're removing. We've got this keeper here. Make sure you pay attention to that. You don't want that to drop down inside of there. Now we can remove our sprocket. We can pull our cam. And then also keep in mind, you've got a keeper right here. I hope that you guys can see this. It's a little plate. Keeps this cam from sliding back and forth. So I'll get this removed and show you what that is. This is the plate that I was talking about there. So sits in that journal there, and then there's a journal in the head, and those kind of work together. So once we get that off, we can should be able to pull our cam. Okay, so we'll remove our chain. Then we'll remove our camshaft. And then if this is as far as we're going, if we're just doing cylinder head work, you wouldn't want to drop this chain down in here. We're actually going to go all the way down. So I'm going to drop it. That way we don't have to hold it anymore. And then I'm going to keep all these parts together here. There's really only one direction that sprocket will go on your cam. Put our spacer, we can keep all this stuff together. And then I'll just lightly screw these bolts in here. We'll set that aside. Now we've got two 10 millimeter nuts on the side here of our cylinder head. So we might have to grab a smaller socket to pull those. What I did here is grab a 1/4 inch extension, an adapter to go from 3/8 to 1/4, and then a smaller 10 millimeter. This is a 1/4 inch socket. And then we can get in there and get those bolts off of there. You could also use a wrench on there. We've got our 14 millimeter bolts here that go all the way down. So those are going to be fairly tight. I'm going to actually use a pneumatic impact here. I got an Ingersoll brand impact. Works really well. All right, now that we have those loosened up, we can take and pull those out. Now you've got a brass washer on all of these, so make sure you grab those. That way, when you flip your head upside down, you don't lose these. It's important that seals these up as well as tightens these down. So we've got our cylinder head bolts there. Looks like two different lengths of them. So these two, it looks like, are going to be a little bit shorter than those. We also have a 12 millimeter bolt coming in from the side here. That's going to hold this cam chain guide on. So grabbing my impact again, sliding that out. You can see there, it's a specialty bolt. I dropped that down in there, which is fine. I'm going to put this bolt back in there, and I can grab that guide as soon as we pull this cylinder head off. Now we have got water line here that we've removed. Obviously, we've got a sensor, and that's going to come up with our head. We've got our two nuts that are off here. And the last bolt that we need, our last nut that we need to remove to get this head off of there is a 12 millimeter coming in from the bottom. So I'm going to grab a wrench here. Keep in mind you are upside down at this point, so you've got to turn it the opposite direction that one would think to loosen that up. Just regular threaded, but I want to make you aware that you're upside down. So that's the nut that we removed. Again, 12 millimeter. Now we've got 10 millimeter over here that we're going to remove. And there's 2 of these nuts over here. They're right underneath of our water line. The camera angle is not great for you to be able to see exactly where these are. All right, now we've got those 2 small nuts there. So we've got our 12 millimeter, our 10 millimeters, and now our head's ready to come off. Now, a lot of times you can just take your fist, kind of tap on it. You don't want to obviously grab a steel hammer and just start pounding on stuff. You're going to damage this aluminum head. But if you need to grab a smaller dead blow hammer and tap on it, you can do that. There is a gasket underneath of here. That would be considered your cylinder head gasket, and it's an actual gasket, not like a liquid gasket that's up here. So sometimes that'll kind of hold things up, but typically with a small rubber mallet or a little dead blow or just a fist pound, you can a lot of times pull that head off of there with no issues. So I've got oil in the top end here, which isn't a bad thing. I've got my cam chain guide here. I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to tip my head over and let that oil drain out, and then I'll show you some things on that cylinder head. We've got our piston here. This is our cylinder, obviously. We've got another guide here. Our cam chain tensioner. So this sat down in here like this. You get that bolt that's holding from the top. That cam chain tensioner actually just took and put pressure on this guide, and that would keep that cam chain tight. Now, if that cam chain wasn't tight, what would happen is you'd be out of time. So your cam would be spinning a different rate as it should be, and your valves would be opening up in the wrong places. So that is one reason why, one out of a couple reasons why you want good guides, good cam chain, and a good tensioner. And then also the other reason would be that cam needs to be timed correctly. And I've showed you that in our valve adjustment video. Make sure you check that out. So pulling both guides off there, this one's a little bit longer. It goes actually all the way down into our bottom end there, and that sits in a groove down there. Now we've got our coolant line here. I'm going to remove this hose, and then we have 2 10 millimeter bolts over here, and I believe that's it for bolts on this. All right, we've got the top clamp off and the bottom clamp off. I'm just going to actually take and remove this at this time, or at least loosen it up. That way when we're ready to pull this cylinder, it's ready to come off of here. So we have the hose pulled off of there. I'm going to grab our 1/4 inch adapter with a 10 millimeter socket on here. Grab our DeWalt impact, remove these 2 nuts here, spin those off. There's our 2 nuts. They're the same as what would be on the top, the cylinder head. So we've got this hose off of there. Now we've got our cylinder that's ready to pop up out of there. Now if our piston is not seized onto our cylinder, we should just be able to lift this out just like this. If it is seized on there, you're going to have some more serious problems pulling this cylinder off. Now if our cylinder or our piston is completely damaged, you could actually take some sort of a hammer and tap that out of there if you're replacing your cylinder. I would not suggest doing that, or absolutely don't do that if you're going to reuse your cylinder and or your piston. Sometimes taking it down to this point, all you'd be doing is putting new rings on there, and I can show you how to measure that. That'll be a separate video on what your ring end gap needs to be, and I'll show you exactly how to measure that. I'll show you how to measure your cylinder and inspect that. I'll show you how to hone this out. So make sure you look for that video on my channel. Now we're going to remove our piston here. A lot of times I'll grab a pick. So take a right angle pick or something similar to that, and you can just take and pull the circlip out. I'll just take my finger and actually stick it inside of that piston pin, because otherwise that clip, especially if you're reusing it, can go flying across the room. We don't want that if we're reusing this piston pin. If you're getting a new piston, new cylinder, a lot of times it'll come with new circlips and a new pin, but not always. Now you can just take then and push that pin out, and this pin could come all the way out. We'll pull it all the way out. You've got a circlip on this side. I'm going to actually take and put our pin back in. Our cylinder and our piston are in excellent shape. We're tearing this apart because we need to get down into our bottom end here. So I'm going to take this circlip, stick it back in. What I do is take the open end, shove it in the groove there. Make sure it's all the way in that groove. Then I'll take my pick Now we've got our crankshaft exposed here. If we need to check and see if our crank is good, what you can do is do your up and down check, your side to side check. Again, I'll show you in a separate video how to check those. When you're going back together, you want to make sure all this gasket surface area is cleaned up. Make sure there's no leftover gasket on there. This is your base gasket. So connected to our cylinder head, in between our cylinder and our cylinder head, that's called your head gasket. This is your base gasket. Now I'm going to flip this motor up. We're actually going to get into the charging system on this Arctic Cat 500 or Suzuki 500. All right, continuing into this Arctic Cat 500, which is the identical to the Suzuki Vinson 500 motor. We've got the recoil pull starter pulled off at this time. I've showed you that in a separate video when we were adjusting valves. So that's the reason why we have that recoil pull starter off. We also have the cup ready to come off of here. You had a 14mm nut that you could pull off. Now you don't have to do that to adjust the valves. We had this pulled off already. So pull that cup off of here. And then you've got a seal in behind here. And that's sometimes why this can stick on there. That's your recoil pull starter cup there. Check top dead center. You've got to have this cap pulled off of here. So we have that loosened up. Then you've got 8mm bolts all the way around here. You've got your water pump assembly here. So underneath of here is going to be your impeller. Then to remove this cover here, I like to use an impact driver. I use the Matco impact driver. We put a P3 bit on there, and then we take and pull this cover off. You can see we've already removed 2 of those bolts there. We're going to remove the other 2 at this time. Just take and do a slam on there. That'll turn that the right direction. You'll be able to spin that right off. Now we can grab our DeWalt impact driver, remove that screw and that one. Now we've got our impeller or our water pump that's going to be able to pull right out of there. There it is there. Underneath of here, we've got your impeller. Here's your shaft that comes, and that'll actually hook up to your part of your transmission there, so it'll constantly be spinning when your engine is spinning. So removing those 2 screws there that we just did will allow you to open this up and get in there. To drain the coolant, I've had a couple questions on that. If you want to drain the coolant out of the motor and out of the radiator, pull this 10mm plug on the bottom of your water pump, and all that coolant will drain out. You also want to open the cap on your radiator. So you'll have quite a bit of force coming out of there. That coolant will be coming out of there pretty quick at first. As soon as you pull this 10mm, then it'll slow down. By that time, you've only drained maybe a half of a quart of coolant at that time. And then you crack your radiator cap and remove that, so all the way at the front of your four-wheeler, and then you'll have coolant just gushing out of here. So it's all, that system's completely sealed up, so when you remove that radiator cap, more coolant will come out very, very quickly. So just be careful of that, knowing where your drain pan is, because it'll splash everywhere. So got our water pump off of there, removed all of our 8mm around this cover here. All right, those are all off. Now we'll be able to remove this stator cover. So we've got our gear selector here. I've showed you how to remove that. When I adjusted the valves, I just got that out of the way so you can see a little bit better. And now we've got this cover. There is going to be a little bit of force because your stator and your flywheel have some magnetic pull. That does make it a little bit of a challenge to remove off of there. A lot of times you can get your fingers in behind there and pull this off. If not, you can grab a mallet or a dead blow here and just tap on a couple different areas. So you can see it's loosened up at this time. Then we'll just get our fingers in there when we can and just kind of work that off of there. There we go. We've got that stator removed. We've got our, whoa. Okay, well now we know where the problem is. So we have our starter here. We've got an idler gear here, and you can see both this cover and this case here are broken, and that's where our problem was. So this four-wheeler wouldn't have been able to start if we had our starter drive hooked up and ready to go because of these gears being broken and falling apart. So that was our problem. Now we know. This charging system still looks like it's in good shape. We'll test that. I'll show you how to do that. Flywheel here looks like it's in good shape. I'll show you how to remove that here in a second. To remove our stator, just 3 8mm bolts here, 2 8mm bolts here, and then this gasket here is able to just be pushed out of the way. Another 8mm bolt here, then you can just lift that stator out of there. So that's how you replace your stator. To remove your flywheel, I'll get to that next. All right, removing the flywheel now. It's very important to follow this step here because I don't want you to damage this crankshaft. This crankshaft goes from here all the way through, obviously the center of our case is there, and into the other side. If you damage this and all you were trying to do would be remove this flywheel here, you're going to end up having to split that case. So pay very close attention. Second thing that I want you to do is if you need this tool, I've got a link below. Make sure you buy the correct tool. If you buy the tool that doesn't have the right thread pitch, sometimes it does left-hand threads versus right-hand threads. Sometimes this isn't long enough. Sometimes this isn't long enough. Sometimes it doesn't include a very, very important tool that I'm going to show you next. You want to make sure you buy the correct tool for this job, or your $500 flywheel is going to end up costing you a completely new motor or just a completely new crankshaft, and you're going to end up having to split that case. So very important, follow these directions here on this next part. Grab an impact driver or whatever you're going to use to remove this nut here. It's a 22mm nut here. I like to use the impact sockets, and I like to use an impact driver here. Put that on there. It's an electric 20-volt impact. Does a fantastic job. Remove that. Now, see how easy that was? Make sure that that gets removed. The next step that you're going to do is obviously buy this tool, link below. Now, this is important. Make sure you have this tool. I've seen hundreds of crankshafts destroyed because they don't use this important part of the tool. And this will come with my kits here. So the flywheel pullers that I sell will include this, and you want to make sure you have this piece. You also want to make sure you have the right flywheel puller. So many times flywheels get screwed up because guys think that they can just go and order any flywheel puller. They order the wrong one. They screw up the threads on your flywheel, or they damage your crankshaft. Please don't do that. Grab this cap here, thread this on. You're actually threading it onto your crankshaft. Spin that down as far as you can go, snug it up. Now grab your actual flywheel puller there and start threading that on. Make sure your threads are straight. Make sure you're going in there correctly. Spin this on as far as you can. If you haven't got it on very far and you didn't order my flywheel puller, then you may have the wrong thread pitch on your flywheel puller. And if that's the case, stop, order the correct one. Spin this all the way on there. You should have it completely seated, and it should be seated onto this flywheel completely. So spin it on there. If you need to, grab a wrench, tighten it up some more. You want to make sure that it's good and secure on there. Next, you're going to grab an impact driver, and you're going to turn this, and it's going to run it all the way in. All right, we've got our 24mm socket now put on there. You're going to take this, and we're going to tighten this down until it's seated. We're going to take, and it's going to be loud, so you're not going to be able to hear me, but I'm going to thread this in until you feel this flywheel pop up. Now, it's not going to pop up very far, so make sure, what I like to do is put my hand on here. A lot of times I'll take a rag, put it on here too, and I'll feel it pop up, and then I'll stop. And make sure you stop, or you can damage some stuff. Okay, you feel it pop up there? Okay, once you feel it pop up there, you're not going to be able to pull it up very far until you remove this puller and then remove that cap that I had you put on. Now, if you did not have that cap, if you didn't order the kit from us and you didn't receive that cap, what's going to happen is this bolt that you're threading in here is going to come down. It's going to hit your crankshaft here. It's either going to bend your crankshaft in, or it's going to damage your crankshaft threads. And I've seen it before where it's bent this entire shaft here, and then your flywheel's turning super fast in there, and your recoil pull starter cup is going to be doing one of these, and it's going to destroy that seal, destroy that case, potentially destroy that stator. So that's why it's so important that you have this cap, you have the correct size puller, and you do it in that order. Okay, once we get the cap removed there, we can take and remove our entire flywheel and our starter gear. So flywheel is removed. That flywheel is in good condition. Now this starter gear here, we've got a woodruff key that's going to hold us in. So you want to make sure that you remove this. When you remove this, you want to make sure that you put it in a place that you're going to remember to put it back in. A lot of times what I'll do is just take and grab it, and then I'll just take and drop it in our flywheel. That way it's there, we know where it's at. We can set that aside. We've got our starter gear here. This is our larger idler gear. And let me show you this. We've got a one-way bearing on the back of this flywheel. You can see we've got some teeth destroyed here. That would have happened when those idler gears got destroyed, but this should only spin one direction. So this direction here is the only way that it'll spin. You take and try to spin it the other way, it's not going to spin. If it does, you want to replace that bearing on the back of your flywheel. We've got a couple other gears we're going to remove here. We have 2 snap rings that we need to remove. And then these gears will just pop right out of here. You want to make sure that when you're pulling these gears, there's little pins running through them. And you want to make sure that those don't fall out and go into your bottom end. So remove this. Got that one removed. There's our pin that I was talking about. So got that removed. We've got this gear pulled. And then this one's got a little pin in there. I'm going to grab some small pliers and pull that one out. If you don't pull this pin out here and you're splitting your case, this is actually going to hold up your entire project. It's going to hold this case together. You're not going to be able to pull that case completely apart because that pin will be holding you up. It'll hit that bearing. So pay attention to that. Make sure that gets removed, but also make sure it gets put back in there when you're putting that motor back together. All right, we've got a 10 millimeter here. This is our shift detent. So when you're shifting through the gears, it'll move this smaller gear here, and that'll change you from high to low or whatever position you're moving it into. Also got our 10 millimeter nut here to remove, and this is the spring-loaded part, so you want to be careful you don't get your fingers in here. You can take and remove that, then we can take, and this spring can be removed then. All right, we have our Speedo gear here. I'm going to pull that off. We've got 2 8 millimeter bolts. And then I'm going to start removing these crankcase bolts. We're not quite ready to split this case, but we will start heading that direction. So I'm going to start removing all these 8 millimeter bolts all the way around. There's a 12 millimeter bolt here, 12 millimeter bolt here, and I think that's maybe all the 12 millimeter bolts on. Oh, there's one here. That 3 of them, I believe, on this side. We're going to flip it over there, and I think there's maybe some more on the other side. All right, so far I've got 8 millimeter bolts, so 1 and then a couple around the outside. I'm going to go ahead and remove those 12 millimeter bolts. So we've got 3 of the 12 millimeter bolts that we've removed. I'm going to go ahead and remove this Speedo gear and take and pry up on that. There's going to be a gasket in behind here, and that'll kind of seal things up for us. There's our Speedo gear here. It's electronic. So some of the older models will have a similar style to this, but there'll be a worm gear that goes down in here. This can be removed with snap ring pliers. So snap ring there. Then you've got a washer here. And then you've got a gear there. So kind of an odd shaped gear, but that'll tell you your miles per hour. You've got a pin that comes in here. I'm going to grab that with a small pair of pliers. That way we don't lose that. That's going to pull out. I'm going to set that with our other parts there. And then I've got a snap ring here. And this snap ring is going to allow us to be able to pull this shaft out from the other side. So I'm going to remove that one there, set that with those parts. Now we're ready to pull that Speedo shaft out the other side there when it comes time to do that. I'm going to flip this motor over at this time. We're going to pull our clutches off there the rest of the way. There's a sensor over there that we need to pull, and then we'll get ready to split this case here. All right, tearing into the clutch side on a Arctic Cat 500, also going to be identical to the Suzuki Vinson 500. This is a Suzuki motor. So this video will work for any of those models. But we've got the clutch cover off at this time. I've showed you how to remove those clutches, and now we're just going to dig into some of these internals here. We've got a sensor that we're going to remove, and we're going to pull these two 4mm Allen bolts out. Got these out. Now we're going to be able to pull that sensor. Going back together, obviously this gasket's going to need to be replaced there. You're going to put this grommet into that groove there, and then you're going to lay that gasket on top of there. Clean this gasket area up really good before going back together. Setting that sensor aside, we've got our clutch here that we're going to pull off. Takes a 24mm socket to remove this. Go ahead and pull this off. Now this is reverse threaded, so you can see I'm spinning it this direction here to remove it. To loosen it up, you want to turn it clockwise. So not your standard direction there. This is called reverse threaded. Going back together, then obviously take this nut, you're going to spin it the other direction. That's going to tighten it up. So kind of weird when you're pulling that off of there, but you want to make sure that you got that going the right direction. Go ahead and remove this clutch. I'm going to keep this nut together with it because our crank nut looks real similar. Wouldn't exactly fit, but the crankshaft on the other side there, holding our flywheel on, takes a nut that looks real similar to it. So I want to make sure we keep our clutch nut with our clutch here. This is called the centrifugal clutch. You want to inspect these shoes here. A lot of times that's what goes bad on these. These just wear down. So if you've got some major clutch slippage, check that part of your clutch out. We've got our cam chain here, very long chain, goes all the way from here all the way up our cylinder, through our head, around our camshaft clear up here. So kind of a longer chain there. You do want to make sure that when you are spinning, when you are disassembling this motor, if your cam chain has fallen down here, a lot of times what happens is it'll get bound up down in here. You take and maybe you try removing your flywheel or removing your clutches. It'll actually turn this crank, and this cam chain will get down in here, it'll get bound up, and it'll actually break the space where your guide sits down below here. Your guide coming in from your cylinder head there will actually sit down into that groove there. Hopefully you can see that there, your camera angle, but there's a groove on your crankcase where this guide's gonna sit. So that's why that groove is there. You cannot have that broken and your motor still function properly. We've got our oil pump here, obviously our oil filter here, and then we've got a crank balancer gear here. This is a 14mm. 14mm, and I like to take and hold my crank. Your impact driver is not going to be stronger than your hand in this case. It's got a lot of gears to turn, so you can actually just take your hand, put it on here, remove that, then we can take our bolt, pull that off of there, and our crank balancer gear can just be pulled up just like this. So we also, just like on the other side, have a very small pin in here that'll keep this case from getting split. We can remove that small pin. We'll keep that together. Now we can take and remove our spacer. Obviously keep that together. We've got our oil pump that we need to remove this snap ring. Remove the snap ring. We can pull our gear off of here. You want to make sure you keep an eye on this little pin. And then there's also a little washer that sits down here. You want to make sure that that doesn't fall off. You can leave that there. We're going to remove our oil pump and kind of put some of these parts back together anyways, just to keep them all together. All right, moving this back cover off here, we've got an Allen wrench. I like to use this again to start it. It is a 6mm. So set it on there, break these loose, then we can grab our impact driver, 6mm, take and turn these out of here. Once we get those removed, we can pull these bolts. We'll take and remove this. And you can see there we've got our shaft that goes all the way through there. And this is just a cover for that shaft. So we'll set that aside for now. And we'll start removing these 8mm and then 12mm to split this case. We haven't forgot about our front output drive shaft here or our rear. I'm going to maybe show you that when we get a little bit farther along here and get this shaft pulled out of there. So we're going to go ahead now, loosen up these bolts. We obviously haven't got our oil pump off yet. We can do that here in a little bit. We wouldn't have to do that now. Just want to get this crankcase split for you guys. All right, we've got 5 12mm bolts, I believe. On this side, this is the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, remember we had 3. So far, we have 8 8mm bolts on the other side. We'll see how many we got here.
1, 2,
Okay, I believe we got 3 8mm, and we'll know more here in a little bit, because if we can't get this apart, we've obviously have another bolt or two stuck in there. Up here is a cap, and that is, they've got a spring and a ball underneath this cap. I like to remove that. Sometimes that can keep our shift drum from actually wanting to split apart. So 17mm, remove that cap there, and then we'll get ready to start tapping on these cases. We'll grab a rubber mallet or a plastic dead blow here and tap in a couple different areas to split this case. Okay, we take a larger dead blow here. This is a 4-pound, and you can get pretty hard on these areas here. What you don't want to do is just start beating and then find out that you haven't actually removed all the bolts that you need to remove. So like the back side here came apart really easily, the front side not so much, so that could mean a couple different things. Either we don't have all the bolts out here, or it's just being a little more difficult. So I'm going to inspect this front side here, make sure everything's pulled apart. Our prop shafts shouldn't be what is holding us up, but you never know. So you obviously want to make sure those 2 pins got pulled out of here, your crankshaft balancer. Okay, another tap on our crankcase here, and everything came apart. So we're at least this far out, probably 1/8 of an inch at least. Over here, probably 1/4 inch. And so probably more than likely we don't have any bolts holding us together. So now we'll continue on with our dead blow here. You can just see it splitting apart just like that. Now I like to take, and actually it's a little brave of me, but I like to stick my fingers in here, and fingers and thumb, and try just splitting those apart with my hand while I tap on it. All right, now you can kind of see that most of our gears are going to stay on one side. We're tapping on this side, everything's being pushed this way. So now what I'll do is actually take my crankcase, set it up like this, and I like to try to keep all those gears in position exactly where they're sitting now. So if you you can take your hands and kind of wiggle it up like this, get them completely split apart. I've got our clutch bolt that's still on here. This will need removed. So we've got now our crankcase completely split for this Suzuki 500 motor. Here's our oil relief valve. Here's our bevel gear going to our output shaft. I'll show you that here in a little bit. But then otherwise, that is it for this side of the crankcase. Our drain pan and our drain bolt is down here. And I believe I showed you how to service this engine. We should have definitely showed you that bolt there. So if you need that, check my videos out to see how you service this Arctic Cat. Should explain this bottom drain pan a little bit better. So I'm going to set this aside. We're going to get down into this bottom end a little bit more. You can see here we've had a gear that's kind of fell down. You want to make sure, what I do a lot of times is I'll take and I'll very slowly pick some of this stuff up. That way we can keep track of where these parts are. So this shaft obviously sits down into our crankcase here, and then you can take and see what that looks like with it being in position there. We're missing a spacer here, one drop down in there. Not a big deal. We can grab that, figure out where that goes. We've got our shift forks that's actually dropped out of place. You can see these are your shift forks here. A lot of times you can just take and pull these out, and then I like to put them back in the same direction that they were going if we can. We might have to wait until we get these transmission gears pulled out of here. So we've got our balancer gear here. Get that removed. This balancer gear, because of it having its weight on one side, you've got to get that in the correct position before you can completely pull that. And then our crankshaft too should just be able to pull right out of this side. We might have to come from the other side, give that a little tap. Our gear shift drum is here. We've got a spacer and a bearing that fell off there. We've got down there, so we've got a washer, we've got a bearing, and then a washer. That's the angle of that, or the direction of that. We'll set that aside. Obviously we've got this gear here, that's an idle gear. Got this complete transmission set. Again, trying to keep all this stuff together. There is all of these gears. We've got a couple movable gears on there. We've got a washer that came off of there. Now that is where our speedo gear connected there. So, okay, our long output shaft, so we've got our front and our rear here, and we're gonna be able to just take and slide that out. Be really careful. You've got a couple different keepers here. This one's in the center. This one sits right down in there. You've got a keeper that'll stay on this bearing. You've got a keeper that'll stay on this bearing, but there are pins that also need to stay in there, so make sure you pay attention to where those are. But this is the only one that we'll actually need to remove. So I'm gonna set this output shaft aside until we can get the rest of the gears and the crank out of here, and then I'll be able to show you how to deal with the output shaft. Crankshaft then, just see so many times guys will grab too big of a hammer or a steel hammer and start tapping on this. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll take this cap here, the same one that we use to remove the flywheel, set that on there, that way we don't damage that crank. Okay, we got that crankshaft out of there. Now we can pull this cap, and then we've got our crankshaft completely out. Now we're gonna be able to remove our balancer gear as well. There's our crank. Set that aside. That's actually in really good condition. We'll grab this balancer shaft there, pull that out, set that aside. We've got one more shaft here that we need to remove, and that's just gonna, we're just gonna need to be able to get in here and take and pull this off. All right, now we've got that final shaft out of there. Now that is everything from what would be the left-hand side of our crankcase. I'm gonna set this aside. We're gonna deal with our output shaft now. I've got our 2006 Arctic Cat 500. Also, this is a Suzuki 500 motor, so your output shafts are going to look real similar. Maybe not exact joints on the exterior of the motor, but for sure the inside is going to look identical to this. So we've got the front of the motor over here, the back of the motor here. So this is the rear output, this is the front output. They actually can be split right there. So if you just want to work with one side or the other, you can take and split them. The reason why I have this case in here is because I wanted to show you how to remove this gear here, and then actually this gear is just going to pull off, our shaft's going to slide through. That's all there is to it. We've got an 1/16 inch socket here. I like to grab one side if you can with a rag and hold that and then spin this. And it shouldn't be too difficult. We've got a 1/2 inch DeWalt impact. Not difficult for that to pull off of there. If it is, you might be going the wrong direction. When you're going back together, you want to take and make sure you ding up this nut. You don't want this nut being loosened as this motor works. So that is why that nut, it has a little ding in there. You remove this gear here, this gear and this gear mesh together. Keep that in mind. And then we've got our regular transmission gear there. Our shaft is going to slide out this way. So that's the shaft there that both of those pieces ride onto. I'm going to set this crankcase aside. We're done with this for now. Now going back together then, we've got our gear there that's going to slide on, our bevel gear there, and then we've got our nut, and that's just how that's going to look there. Set that aside. Now I have done so many videos on the U-joints, replacing U-joints on ATVs and UTVs. Probably not going to do another one. I'm going to fly through here. I'm going to remove this nut. I'm going to detach both of these. On this side here, we've got 10mm bolts. So we've got 4 of them around this outside of this joint here. So removing this outside one, 10mm out. Okay, all 4 of those are removed, and then we've got a nut down in there that we're going to pull. So we've got this joint completely separated. We've got splines there. We've got boot clamps that go on here. And again, this is going to the rear differential. So setting that aside, there's nothing more we're going to do with that one. This one, we're going to grab a 22mm socket, and we can grab our 1/2 inch DeWalt impact again. Removing that, so we've got our nut there, obviously held on with some thread lock. We've got a washer here. And then you've got your coupling here. That can be removed there. You've got your bearing here that can be replaced, and that is your rear output shaft. Setting that aside, so now we've got our front assembly left. I'm gonna go through and quickly remove that U-joint. Again, if you want exact details on how to remove those, I've got countless videos of me replacing U-joints on different makes and models. Probably some Arctic Cats. I've just done so many of them. I don't feel like I need to do another one for you guys. I'll put a link below on how to do that process. This joint is completely shot, so we're not going to reuse those caps. I'm going to remove that nut there. Again, 22 millimeter. And once you get that nut removed, then you can take and pull that yoke off as well. So there is your front drive shaft there. To replace this gear here, you've got a couple snap rings that you can pull off of there, and this gear will just slide right out. That is the front prop shaft and complete motor disassembly on the Arctic Cat 500. Also, like I said several times, this is the Suzuki 500 motor, so the Vinson 500, and I'm not sure if the Quadmaster is going to be the same as this or not, but it will be real similar, a lot of the similar parts. So make sure you check out my other videos. Give us a thumbs up if the video has been helpful. We've got a bunch of other videos on ATVs, UTVs, motorcycles, and jet skis. Check those out. Leave us a comment below. We appreciate any feedback we can get from you guys. Thanks a lot.